The overhead lights in Vadim Sorokin's office were the expensive kind. No flicker, no hum, nowhere to look that wasn't directly at the man across the desk from me. His hands were flat on the mahogany, perfectly still, and he was watching me with a patience that felt more threatening than any raised voice could have. "Tell me what you heard," he said, every word. And Reese, he paused just long enough to make my pulse spike. "Don't make me ask twice." 6 weeks earlier, I had been nobody he'd ever think to look at twice. "My name is Reese Duval, 27 years old, a nurse at County General on Chicago's South Side, and the single mother of a 5-year-old girl named Cleo, who had a peanut allergy so severe I kept 2 EpiPens in my scrub pocket at all times. My apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up in Pilsen that smelled like someone else's cooking, and had a radiator that banged all winter like it had a personal grudge. I drove a 9-year-old Civic with a cracked rear bumper. I ate whatever Cleo didn't finish for dinner, because food waste felt like an insult when money was that tight. I was fine. I told myself that every morning at 5:45 while I laced up my sneakers in the dark. The night Misha Sorokin came into our ER, I was 40 minutes from the end of a double shift and running on gas station coffee and sheer stubbornness. He was 8 years old, unconscious, and the men who carried him through our sliding doors looked like they had never set foot inside a hospital and were personally offended by the experience. Black coats, hard eyes. One of them had a tattoo climbing the side of his neck that I recognized, distantly, as the kind of thing that appeared in news reports about organized crime. I didn't have time to think about that. I had a child with a head laceration, a BP dropping, and possible internal bleeding, and that was all that existed for the next hour. His name, I only learned it later, was Mikhail Sorokin. The men who'd brought him hovered at the edge of the trauma bay like they'd been stationed there. When I finally looked up long enough to register the room, there was a new one standing apart from the others. Tall, dark suit, no tie, like he'd been somewhere formal and left before it ended. His eyes moved over the scene with a kind of methodical inventory that wasn't frantic, and that was somehow worse. Most people, when a child they love is bleeding on a table, fall apart. This man was cataloging. "He's stable," I said, before he could ask. "We're waiting on imaging." He took a significant blow to the head. "Can you tell me what happened?" He looked at me for a long moment. Not the way men usually look at nurses. Like we're furniture that talks. Like he was actually deciding something. "He fell," he said. It wasn't even a convincing lie, but pressing it wasn't my job, and I had 3 other patients, so I didn't. 2 hours later, Misha was upstairs sleeping off a mild concussion and 2 cracked ribs. I stopped by on my way out because I'd promised the attending I would. The man was sitting in the chair next to Misha's bed with his jacket over the back of the chair, reading something aloud from his phone. Something in Russian. His voice was low and even, and completely different from the voice he'd used in the trauma bay. I stood in the doorway for probably 10 seconds longer than I needed to. He looked up. "Sorry," I said, "just checking his vitals before I go." He stood while I worked. Didn't hover, didn't ask useless questions, just gave me space and watched. When I finished, I told him the numbers meant everything was trending the right direction, and he nodded. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did tonight." "I'm a nurse," I said, "it's what I do." "Not everyone does it the way you did." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said goodnight and left. 3 days later, a Mariano's gift card appeared in an envelope taped to my locker. No name, no note. Enough to cover 2 weeks of groceries. I asked around. Nobody knew anything. I told myself it was probably a patient's family. It happened sometimes, and I bought groceries and didn't think too hard about it. Then Cleo's pediatrician called to tell me the balance on her account had been paid in full, $1,140. I'd been paying it down 50 at a time. I sat in my car in the hospital parking structure for a long time after that call. I knew it was him. The knowing sat in my chest like a stone. Not just gratitude, but something more unsettling. He knew where I worked, who my daughter was, what I owed. But Cleo's bill was gone, and I was exhausted, and I told myself I would figure out what it meant tomorrow. He came to the hospital the following week. Not as a patient and not for Misha, who'd been discharged 3 days prior. He came to the 3rd-floor nurse's station and asked for me by name. I made him wait 9 minutes. That was not an accident. You paid my daughter's medical bill, I said when I finally came to the desk. I did. I didn't ask you to. No, he said. He looked entirely unbothered. You didn't. I want to pay you back. That's not necessary. It is to me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that he decided against at the last second. All right, he said. Coffee. You can buy me a coffee. Which was how I ended up in the little cafe on the ground floor of County General with Vadim Sorokin, learning that his name was Vadim, that Misha was the son of his younger brother who had died 2 years ago, and that he took his coffee black and looked at me. Like I was a problem he was genuinely interested in understanding. You're not scared of me, he said, somewhere around the bottom of his cup. I laughed before I could stop myself. I work nights in a level 1 trauma center in Chicago. I've recalibrated my definition of scary. He almost smiled again. I was starting to learn to watch for it. After that, he came back. Not constantly, not in a way I could predict. Every week or so, coffee, a conversation, once a very serious debate about whether the vending machine on the 3rd floor was worth the $3 it charged for pretzels. He had opinions. They were unexpectedly specific and thoughtful. He never pushed, never asked for more than I offered. He asked about Cleo with genuine curiosity, and when I told him about her peanut allergy and her obsession with prehistoric marine life, and the fact that she had recently decided the color orange was personally offensive to her, he listened like it mattered. That terrified me more than anything else. Because by then I knew who he was. Chicago isn't that big, and I had Google, and Vadim Sorokin's name appeared in enough local news archives that the picture assembled itself without much effort. Organized crime, Russian syndicate, 11 federal investigations that had never produced charges. A reputation that made certain names in city government go quiet. I should have stopped the coffee visits. I didn't. 3 weeks in, I was charting in a supply room off the main corridor when I heard voices outside the prop door, one of them his. Vadim wasn't supposed to be here. I hadn't known he was coming. I should have made noise. I should have pushed the door open and announced myself. I froze instead, because the second voice said something that stopped me cold. The transfer happens Friday. Fedorov's already in position. If it goes the way we planned, the task force won't find anything until it's too late to. Enough, Vadim's voice flat and hard, not here. Nobody's listening. Someone is always listening. We're done for tonight. Footsteps, the door didn't open after a moment's silence. I stood in that supply room for 4 minutes without moving. My heart was doing something unpleasant against my ribs. I didn't know who Fedorov was. I didn't know what the transfer meant. I told myself I'd misunderstood something with an entirely innocent explanation. What I also knew was that my charge nurse and closest work friend, Patsy, had mentioned a week earlier that her brother-in-law worked for the FBI, and that there had been increased federal activity around organized crime in the city. She'd said it the way people say things when they want you to know something, without technically saying it. I'd filed it away without meaning to. I didn't call anyone. What I did do, and I have thought about this every single day since, was mention what I'd heard to Patsy. I told her because I was shaken, and I needed to say it out loud to someone I trusted. I told her because I didn't know what else to do with it. Patsy, it turned out, had been quietly cooperating with a federal informant for 8 months. I didn't know that. She passed it along. I found out what I'd done 3 days later, when Vadim walked into the hospital with an expression that made every person in his immediate vicinity find somewhere else to be. He asked the woman at the front desk to tell me he was waiting. I took the elevator down with my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from doing anything embarrassing. He was standing near the entrance, coat on, 2 of his usual associates at a careful distance. The look on his face when I came through the doors was not angry, and that was somehow so much worse than anger. It was cold in the specific way that things get cold when they've been very, very warm. "Walk with me," he said. "I have patience." "You're on break," I checked. I walked with him. Outside in the small concrete courtyard behind the building, he stopped and faced me. The thing you heard, he said. You told someone. It wasn't a question. I didn't pretend it was. Yes. Who? I told him everything. Patsy, the federal informant I hadn't known about, the supply room I hadn't been supposed to be in, the conversation I hadn't meant to overhear and hadn't known what to do with. He listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he looked at me for a long time. Why are you telling me the truth right now? He asked. You had time to prepare a story. Because I didn't do it to hurt you, I said. I didn't know what I was passing along, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. Something in his face changed, small, almost nothing, but I'd been paying attention. He turned away, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the parking structure. The wind off the lake was doing its worst, and I hadn't brought my jacket. Cleo, he said finally, where is she right now? Every nerve in my body went sharp and quiet at the same time. With my neighbor, why? Because what you inadvertently passed along has created a situation, he said, turning back to me. Until I understand the full scope of it, I need you both somewhere I can ensure your safety. I'll have someone bring her. No, the word came out flat and final, not scared. Furious, and there is a difference. You do not take my daughter anywhere without my consent. That is not something I'm negotiating. He was quiet, watching me. You're angry, he said. Yes, I'm angry. I stumbled into something I didn't ask to know, made a mistake because I was scared, and your response is to involve my 5-year-old. I held his gaze and didn't let go. Tell me what you actually need from me. Talk to me like I'm a person. Don't move pieces around. The courtyard was very still. All right, he said. It came out like I'd passed something. Come to my office tonight after your shift. There are things I need to explain. And Cleo stays with my neighbor. A pause. And Cleo stays with your neighbor. His office was in the West Loop in a building that looked like a perfectly legitimate consulting firm, which I suspected was the point. 15th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows. Furniture that probably cost more than I made in a year. He had coffee waiting when I arrived. I noticed that. One associate posted outside the door. I noticed that too. Sit down, he said, but this time it wasn't a command, it was an offering. I sat. He told me, in measured and specific language that suggested he'd thought carefully about how much to say, what the transfer I'd overheard actually was. A legitimate financial asset transfer that needed to be timed precisely to avoid misinterpretation by a federal task force that had been building a case against his organization for years. The information reaching an informant 2 days early hadn't derailed it, but it had forced him to move quickly in ways that drew attention he hadn't wanted. He told me this was manageable, but that I needed to understand what I'd walked into. Are you in danger? I asked. He tilted his head slightly. I'm always in some degree of danger. That's not new. Is Cleo in danger because of what I did? The care with which he answered told me something about him. Not because of what you did, he said. You couldn't have known. But there are people who will now know I have an interest in your situation. That changes things for you, regardless of your intent. I sat with that for a moment. What do you need from me? I asked. Honesty, he said. And to let me ensure your safety while certain things are resolved. Not by taking your daughter. I heard you. But by being straight with you about the risk and letting you decide how to respond to it. No one in my life had ever put it to me that way. The letting you decide part. I was so accustomed to being arranged around, by schedules, by money, by the basic physics of being a single parent who was always one emergency from the edge, that someone handing me the choice felt almost foreign. Why do you care what happens to us? I asked. Honestly, not the version you've decided I can handle. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. My brother's name was Dmitri, he said finally, Misha's father. He spent most of his life trying to get out of the world I was already too deep in to leave. He almost made it. A pause. He didn't, and Misha has been my responsibility since then. He looked at the city through the window. When Misha was on that table and you were working on him, you weren't calculating the room, you just worked. I've spent a long time in spaces where everyone around me is calculating something. It's noticeable when someone isn't. I was calculating plenty, I said, his intracranial pressure, his O2 sats. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close, and I felt it somewhere inconvenient. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to dismiss." I drank my coffee and didn't say anything to that, because I didn't trust what might come out. He asked about Cleo that night, not strategically, I believed, but out of something that looked like genuine interest. He asked what she liked, whether kindergarten had started, whether the allergy scared me. I was honest. Yes, constantly, not dramatically, just in the low-grade, persistent way of someone who knows exactly how fast things can go wrong and has to function anyway. He nodded like he recognized that specific kind of fear. "Misha had nightmares for almost a year after Dmitri died," he said. "Every night. I'd sit outside his door and read out loud until I heard him go quiet. A brief pause. I'm not built for sitting still." "I can tell." "And yet, what were you reading?" A flicker of something that on a different man might have been sheepishness. Whatever was close. There was a stretch of 3 months where I got through most of a book on maritime trade routes in the 18th century. I laughed, a real one, startled out of me. He looked at me like I'd handed him something he hadn't expected to want. The next 2 months weren't simple. There were things I didn't ask about and things he didn't volunteer, and I was clear-eyed about what that meant. I wasn't naive about his world, but I also watched him with Cleo. He came to pick me up from work one evening. This was later, after things had shifted into something I didn't have a clean word for yet, and Cleo had been dropped off early and was in the waiting area working a floor puzzle. Vadim crouched down next to her without hesitation and asked what she was building. "Spinosaurus," Cleo said without looking up. "It's the biggest carnivore. People think it's T-Rex, but they're wrong." "They are wrong," Vadim said, completely serious. "T-Rex is overrated." Cleo looked up at him for the first time, that specific reassessment that 5-year-olds do when an adult says exactly the right thing. "Do you know about the Mosasaurus? It's not technically a dinosaur, but it's still important." "Tell me," he said. She told him. For 11 minutes by the clock on the wall, a man who moved through rooms the way weather systems do, giving a child his complete and undivided attention. Later, when Cleo was asleep in the back seat and Chicago moved past the windows, he said quietly, "She's going to be formidable." "She already is," I said. He nodded like that was the right answer. There was a night, about a week after that, when he told me about his father, a man who had built what Vadim inherited and treated loyalty as currency and warmth as stupidity. He told me matter-of-factly, not looking for sympathy, just answering my question about why Misha's nightmares had been his problem to carry instead of anyone else's. He told me he had decided at a specific and nameable point that his inheritance was worth keeping in some ways and worth dismantling in others. "The things that rot what's underneath," he said. "I'm not under illusions about what I've built, but rot spreads. I've been cutting it out for 2 years. "Does it work?" I asked. "Actually work?" "Ask me in a year." I looked at him. The city lights were doing something complicated to the angles of his face. "I'm asking you now," I said. He held my gaze. "I don't know yet, but I know why I'm trying. Something in his voice that hadn't been there before, that's new." I made my decision somewhere around then. Not dramatically, not in a speech. Quietly, the way the decisions that actually count tend to happen. I decided the risk was real and the fear was real, and this man was both more dangerous and more worth knowing than anything rational could explain, and I was going to trust him anyway. Not blindly. Not as a contract I couldn't exit. As a beginning. Cleo asked about him constantly. She'd decided, on the strength of the Mosasaurus conversation, that he was one of the more interesting adults in her orbit, and she had firm opinions about interesting adults. She asked when we were seeing Vadim again. She asked if he liked macaroni and cheese. She asked once, with the guileless precision that only small children have, whether he was going to be around a lot. I said I thought so. She said good and went back to her puzzle. I texted him that night, which I hadn't done first before. I told him what she'd said. He replied in under a minute. "Tell her the mac and cheese answer is yes." I laughed alone in my kitchen at 11 p.m. and decided that counted for something real. 7 months later, on a Sunday afternoon when Cleo was at a birthday party, and the apartment had gone quiet in the way it does, when you notice the quiet. Vadim made dinner in my small kitchen, with the precision of someone who had learned to cook seriously and late in life. We ate at my second-hand table. He'd brought wine that probably cost more than my electric bill, and poured it into my mismatched glasses from college, without commenting on them. After dinner, I was washing up and he was drying, which was something I still hadn't entirely adjusted to. The way he moved through my ordinary life like he'd been waiting for permission to fit into it, and he said, without any particular ceremony, I'd like this to be the life, specifically this. I turned to look at him. You and Cleo, he said, whatever version of this is built to last. That's a significant thing to want, I said. Yes. You understand what I'd need, honesty, a real say in things that affect us. Cleo is always first. Yes, no hesitation. And I'm not a piece you move, I said. If you need me to stay somewhere or stop asking something because it's safer, tell me why. Give me the reason. Don't just arrange things around me. He set down the dish he was drying. He looked at me with that look I'd spent 7 months learning, the one that meant he'd already made his decision and was letting me catch up. No, he said, I don't just move pieces. I turned back to the sink. My hands were warm from the water. Outside, a bus went by, and somewhere down the block someone was playing music too loud for October, and the radiator in the corner was making the sound it made right before it started actually working. Okay, I said. Okay, he said, and picked up the dish. That night, I thought about Dmitri and maritime history read in the dark outside a child's door, and I thought about Cleo telling a man she'd known 4 minutes that the Mosasaurus was important, and getting not just agreement but attention. I thought about all the reasons it was complicated, and why that was something I could live with. Not every story starts somewhere that makes sense. Mine started in a supply room where I froze when I should have moved, and then told the truth when I could have lied, and somehow that turned out to be the right order of things. I don't know if I'd call it fate. I'd call it 2 people who each had more to lose than they'd admitted, deciding separately and then together that some things were worth risking the loss. Cleo called him Vadim because I'd taught her to use people's names, and he told her she could call him whatever she wanted. She considered this with the gravity she applied to important decisions, 3 full weeks of consideration. Then one evening she called him V, and he looked at her like she'd handed him something he hadn't known he was missing. I had to find something to do in the kitchen very quickly. Some things you don't have a word for. You just recognize them when they're in front of you. I recognized it. And I decided it was enough to build on.